Okay, so I'll get us started here. So time for our cleanup panel. The only thing between you and a drink. I'm just kidding. We have a great panel lined up for you. So I just wanted to stress the Slido is a great tool, certainly for engagement, but don't be scared to do it the old-fashioned way as well. Although these exchanges have been great for millennials, just see an entire Q&A over phone is really great. So now I'm excited to introduce our final panel for the day. They're going to focus on new business models and rate designs. Really, I think it's a perfect segue from our last panel, as one of the key challenges is always cost allocation when it comes to transmission projects. So I'll turn it over to the panel to introduce themselves, and I look forward to hearing about who will pay for the future grid. And I should also add the one we need to refurbish right now.
Okay, thank you very much, Justin. And there's a clicker for the presentation, because we're gonna lead off with David. So
yeah, it's up here at the front on the podium, but I can bring it over there if you'd like.
All right. Good. Thanks very much. Yeah. Yes, Justin. This is the panel that on the one hand stands between the participants and the bar. On the other hand, what we've done, and you see the names up here. Not to cast aspersions on any of the other panels today. Certainly not the first one that I was a part of, Steve. But I think we really have saved the best for last. That will be my contention. And then maybe we'll do a Slido vote at the end as to whether or not we did in fact save the best for last. As you mentioned, Justin, I mean, this is a really important question. Who pays? Ultimately, and how things are paid for, what those models are going to look like, how we do design. I mentioned it at the very beginning this morning in terms of one of the challenges that has been attempted to be tackled in a large variety of different forums that have tried to solve the conundrum, and there is no magic bullet. Unfortunately, but what we do have today are a series of presenters, 4 presenters, and you'll find their bios in the material that had been circulated, who will talk about different aspects of these questions. And first up, I'm delighted to introduce actually somebody who's actually a homeboy here. This is where he's based. That's the good news. The bad news is I think you kept getting pulled away to your office today. But David is here locally, but I see David a great deal at Campwood and also at the ESCC. So David Wow, head of the BCUC, here also has wide experience in the broader North American regulatory environment. So with that, David, take it over. It's all yours.
Great, thank you, Francis. Good morning, or sorry, yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. I'm the chair of the BC Utilities Commission, as Francis just said, and we regulate oil and gas utilities here in British Columbia, along with providers of thermal energy. And part of that is we regulate mandatory reliability standards and the electric grid here in British Columbia. And I do also represent CAMPUT, which is our National Association of Canadian Regulators. And I'm going to try and provide some perspective as a Canadian utility regulator. It's indeed true that our industry faces unprecedented change. Over the last few years, we've witnessed the advent of innovative technologies, shifting generation mixes, and new customer demands and policy imperatives. For example, in BC, we have seen rapid declines in the cost of new generation, flattening utility loads, and a government policy initiative aimed at making BC industry the cleanest in the world through industrial and upstream electrification. We can't know exactly how the future will evolve, but we can be sure that the pace of change, driven by new technologies, will increase and that the sector will become increasingly complex. As a result of these changes, most utilities agree that it's time to rethink the way they charge for electricity. They understand that technological advances in power generation alternatives are making current approaches obsolete, and that the real debate is over what tomorrow's rate design should look like. As an energy regulator, we want customers to receive the heat, light, electromotive force, and now even transportation at the lowest overall cost. Accurate pricing can play a key role in achieving this by encouraging all electricity use that is economically justified, discouraging waste and lowering utility costs through encouraging efficient demand-side participation in the market. In transmission rate design, one of our key principles is that the system user should pay for the costs they create. Not only is this fair, but it's also likely to lead to more efficient use of the energy system. There are, however, sunk costs of the grid which remain and which have to be recovered. It's important that users benefiting from the network infrastructure are contributing fairly towards its operation and upkeep, and that these costs are not simply falling on those least able to respond. A key issue in transmission rate design is therefore how to recover these leftover costs from customers in an increasingly competitive environment. For example, if these costs are recovered through variable charges, a customer could respond by installing behind-the-meter generation. If a transmission provider then tries to raise the demand charges instead, a customer could respond by installing batteries. These kinds of customer responses can be great when transmission prices reflect real cost impacts. But when the prices don't reflect costs, customers are still going to respond, and that will undermine system efficiency. The UK regulator Ofgem has recently reviewed their methodology for recovering these leftover sunk transmission costs, when they're referred to as residual charges. And they've developed 3 principles which could be useful for regulators looking to grapple with similar issues. The last 2 pricing principles relate to fairness in the recovery of residual charges and proportionality and practical considerations. This includes ensuring that solutions are undertaken with a minimum disruption of the industry and stakeholders. We don't want to have change for change's sake, and as everyone's starting point is different, as well as differences in incremental cost drivers and customer types and preferences, there isn't a one-size-fits-all rate design solution to these market changes we are seeing. However, the first of the pricing principles is a principle of reducing harmful distortions, such as inefficient investment in generation for the purpose of reducing these residual charges. Concerns about inefficient generation investment was also an issue for the BCUC in a standby rate proceeding a few years ago. There was a concern that a customer could invest in behind-the-meter generation that was more expensive than the utility's incremental cost to supply the customer, solely as a result of avoided network costs. In our decision, we suggested draft standby principles which took this into account, noting that standby charges should not be so low as to promote uneconomic bypass of the grid or inefficient maintenance of customer-owned generation assets, or secondly, so high as to discourage the growth of cost-effective self-generation. I guess that's the end of my slides. No, there we go. Harmful distortion can also go the other way. When you look at rate design from the perspective of encouraging beneficial electrification, which is a key policy objective here in British Columbia. Bonbright who's often considered the father of rate design, looked at the effect of competitive pressures on the telecom industry in the 1980s. And there his rate design advice, which I think also applies to the electricity industry today, which faces similar competitive pressures, is that the lowest cost provider should be the lowest price supplier. Now, if you think about that, it means that in designing rates in today's competitive environment, utilities will need to have a good understanding of not just their own marginal costs, but their customers' preferences and competitive options. Only then can you see if you're the lowest cost provider. And if you're not also the lowest price supplier, think about whether rate design changes are needed. For example, Bonbright also supports discounting of rates for price-sensitive customers where lower rates are needed to get business that would not otherwise occur, and the rate at least recovers the marginal costs and makes some contribution to fixed costs. These new competitive pressures therefore require a shift in focus from an accounting to a marketing frame of mind. Utilities that have robust energy efficiency programs have an advantage here in that through their energy efficiency team, they should already have a good understanding of their customers. This can be an invaluable asset in the move to smarter rate design. Utilities in BC have started to do some interesting work with tailored rate designs that target electrification opportunities. And an example of this is BC Hydro's shore power rate, which was mentioned earlier today. And it provides clean grid electricity to ships at berth to substitute for onboard diesel generation. And as you probably know, Vancouver is a large port, and we have a large cruise ship industry here. And cruise ships sitting idling all day in port, generate not only an amount of air pollution, but they also provide a lot. It's noisy and provides a lot of there's a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. And this has been a great opportunity for BC Hydro to clean up that part of energy consumption here at the port. And I would encourage you to keep up to date with the innovations in BC that are occurring in this area. In summary, as utilities rethink their rate philosophies, they need to think strategically. Looking ahead, the best rate design solutions will be those that address not only the amount of power consumed, but also when it's consumed and how it affects the utility's costs. As a regulator, we also seek to have a rate design process built on transparency, fairness, accessibility, and accountability, with solid data and transparent modeling that's credible and available to all. And we look forward to working with stakeholders to achieve this outcome. Thanks, Francis.
That's great. Thank you very much, David. We're going to go right through to the four presentations, and then we'll come back to discussion and Q&A. And so, without further ado, Rudy Wynter, who's the President and Chief Operating Officer, Wholesale Networks and United States Capital Delivery at National Grid. Rudy, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me today to this panel and this really, really interesting day. So thank you, Lawrence, for everything you've done in organizing this. I'm going to pretty much really focus my comments on National Grid US for the part of our panel today. But just by way of introduction, as you mentioned, my name is Rudy Wynter. I run part of the business for National Grid in the United States. National Grid, as you know, is a US, UK-based energy company. In the US, we own and operate a transmission network. We're the largest transmission network in the northeastern United States. We have an HVDC interconnection that goes right up to the Canadian border, and then Mark and everyone at Hydro-Quebec takes it over from there. And that brings in a lot of hydro into the Northeast region for us every day for about the last 27 years. Aside from our transmission business, we also are a distribution company in the United States. We have electric distribution utilities and natural gas distribution utilities, all in the northeastern United States, New York, and many states in New England. We also have a generation business. We have about 4,000 megawatts of generation on Long Island in New York, and we also own some solar generation in New England and New York, as well as some battery energy storage. Finally, in our U.S. business, we've got National Grid Ventures, which is our unregulated arm, which owns a solar developer in the Midwestern United States that has a pipeline of investments across the U.S. And finally, National Grid Partners. That's our business in Silicon Valley, and that's a business that we utilize to make investments in energy startups and businesses that are adjacent to the energy sector as well. I think if we're going to talk about regulation, you can see from our portfolio in the U.S., we've got exposure across federal regulation. In the U.S., the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, really sets our transmission rates and our transmission tariffs. And our distribution companies in New York and New England, those rates are set by state regulators. So at National Grid in the U.S., we see the gamut of regulatory activity across FERC as well as across our state regulators. It's easy, and I think it's happening around the world, it's easy to just point out that the U.S. electric industry is going through an era of unprecedented change, really driven by increased renewables, integrating into the grid, rapid advances in technology, and all the while utilities like National Grid need to make sure that reliability and resilience of the electric system is maintained throughout that. And that can be challenging at times, as we're experiencing right now in some parts in New England, where we have a high proliferation of solar in parts of the network that, quite frankly, are not our most robust parts of the network. And we could talk about what drove that and what we're doing about it, and the frustration it gives to solar developers while we're working through that. Some of the challenges that we have, and as well as some of the opportunities, are really driven by the aggressive decarbonization policies that the states have in which we operate. If you look at the United States, the more aggressive decarbonization policy at the state levels are occurring across on the Pacific West and then in the Northeast, and we pretty much operate in the Northeast. That's going to bring about a number of challenges, but it'll also bring about a number of opportunities. The region where I operate, if you look at what is stated by the various states between now and 2035, we want to build about 15 gigawatts of offshore wind. Right now, there's about 30 megawatts. So a large build-out's going to occur across New York, New England, New Jersey, and the Mid-Atlantic states. Finally, to achieve all of the big policy objectives that we have in those states, it isn't going to be done by rooftop solar. It's largely going to be done by renewables at scale, which means that transmission investments are going to have to be made. As I mentioned before, the states in which I operate also have aggressive decarbonization policies, which really means high proliferation of electric vehicles as well, which will drive up electric growth, and that also is going to require additional infrastructure investments. So for the most part, when we look at new business models, new rates, things like that, we're always wrestling with how do we make sure we're getting recovery for all these new investments, but we also have a distribution company, so we're keenly aware of the bill impact all this is going to have on end-use consumers as well. So we try to balance all of those as we are moving forward in this transition and also looking for ways of reducing and helping reduce that bill impact to customers.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Rudy, we're going to jump now over to Rohan Seale from Barbados Light and Power. Rohan, it's your turn to give us your views.
Good afternoon, all. It's a pleasure to be here, all the way from small island state of Barbados. Someone mentioned earlier when we first came in, they commented when they walked in as if they felt they were in United Nations General Assembly. And on that point, they start with a quotation from a former Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, when he said that Barbados punches above its weight in several areas, so it must do so with regard to the environment from all levels of society, end of quote. And with that, as a utility, I want to mention that we certainly embrace that idea of being stewards of the environment, and as such we have what we call in Barbados a 100-100 vision, meaning 100% renewables and also 100% electrification. And that visionary goal is one where we believe that is not only required from a climate change, adaptation and mitigation point of view when you look at the severity of hurricanes crossing the Atlantic, but we also embrace it because we believe it's the right thing to do. That being said, just to give you some stats on Barbados, a very small island, we're a vertically integrated utility, but we're a subsidiary of Emera, which operates out of the northeast of Canada, Nova Scotia, and they also have assets in Tampa, Florida, in North America. We're a very small island nation of only 280,000 persons, 431 square kilometers, so you can see our size. Our economy is heavily dependent on tourism, offshore financial services, light manufacturing, and also agriculture. From an electricity service point of view, as we mentioned, we are well on the way with regard to our RE target of 100%, whereby we have already 10 megawatts of grid-scale solar installed. From a distributed point of view, as my colleague mentioned, in terms of rooftop solar, there's about 24 megawatts available. That has been encouraged. And we also have, as a leader in storage, the utility has already installed 5 megawatts of utility-scale battery storage. And these are all transformational in terms of clean energy, and we have other clean energy projects in terms of wind coming on. And of course, when we look at the growth and the capacity, and also, as mentioned, the fact that both the regulator and the policymakers want to push us towards achieving 100% renewables by 2030, we recognize that significant investments has to be made in the transmission and distribution grid to facilitate all of this. In fact, to translate the almost 944 gigawatt hours of energy that we produce annually. To be able to transition to 100% renewables requires about 600 megawatts of renewable power. And how we expect that to be deployed really is about, let's say 350 megawatts of solar. We intend to build about 80 megawatts of onshore wind, 95 megawatts of offshore wind, 60 megawatts of biomass, and 150 megawatts of storage. So we could imagine the kind of infrastructure that would be required to interconnect that amount of generation to the system. And of course, the question comes up as to who will pay for this infrastructure. In fact, the calculated value to be able to achieve that outside of the transmission and distribution costs is about 4 billion Barbados dollars, or about $2 billion US dollars for that investment. So in pursuit of that 100% RE vision, substantial RE infrastructure investments is planned annually over the next 5 years. And in terms of the business models, of course, a flexible cost recovery mechanism will be required to facilitate these investments, and also to reduce regulatory lag and the frequency of general rate reviews. And one of the mechanisms that we're looking at relates to a capital tracker mechanism in the form of what we call a CET, or Clean Energy Transition Tracker. That's under consideration as a tool to facilitate the recovery of these significant RE investments that has to be made, as well as the grid modernization effort that is already underway. In fact, we've already started to replace over 130,000 of our meters. We are about 65% along the way. 85,000 meters or smart meters have already been deployed. And what that will do, it will facilitate the transition to RE, as well as allow us to deploy other tools such as time of use rates for our residential customers. As mentioned, I think one of my colleagues did well in alluding to the fact that a lot of this share cannot just be distributed rooftop. We have to facilitate independent power producers or third-party suppliers. And of course, the mechanisms are already underway, both by the regulator and also the policymakers, to facilitate not only Barbados Light and Power having a share in this over 600 megawatts of renewable energy, but also allowing third-party suppliers to provide both solar, wind, and also storage as well. What's interesting is that the policymakers at home are actually contemplating allowing special carve-outs by certain entities, such as the local water authority, to have a portion of that RE share, a portion to the what we call the Barbados Water Authority, or the local water company, to of course allow them to also become profit-making, because right now they're not profit-making, and also to allow, as one of the presenters this morning related to the 5Ds, in terms of this whole idea of democratization, that's a big or key word home in terms of allowing local investment in addition to foreign investment, so that the whole democratization of RE is also facilitated. One of the reasons why we believe that the alternative approach in terms of trackers, these have been successfully deployed in many jurisdictions, as you would know, here in the US. Trackers have been applied to a variety of utility expenditures, such as fuel, power purchase, and capital expenditures, including those for renewable generation, transmission and distribution upgrades, as well as advanced metering infrastructure. And when we sample some of the utilities, we recognize that in the US, at least 107 of the 128 utilities that we have sampled utilize trackers, and approximately half use the capital tracker mechanism for their T&D infrastructure. And this is more prevalent compared to generation capacity trackers. Just from a challenges, opportunities point of view, one of the things that we have to be careful and guard against is the whole idea of cross-subsidies. And what we notice, particularly at Barbados Light and Power, locally, some of the investors who invest in renewable generation at their site, they actually can upgrade or request an upgrade in some of the T&D assets to cover their generation on their side, to supply the utility. And when that happens, as mentioned, we have to ensure that they pay their fair share of the T&D costs, because they can request a transformer that significantly outweighs the previous transformer that was supplying that particular entity. So one of the things we have to look at will be the degree of cross-subsidization among those entities to ensure that that's not pushed to a ratepayer who cannot afford such a cost. In terms of customer options, one of the things that we've been doing over the past few years is really empowering our customers to make smart decisions with regard to energy efficiency, and also assisting them with shifting their habits in terms of time of use rates. And of course, we're looking at EV charging, both smart and convenience charging, and developing rates for that as well, and time of use rates around that. And in terms of leadership, Barbados Light and Power actually has the largest fleet of electric vehicles on the island. And electric vehicles are actually the fastest selling vehicle in Barbados currently, compared to fuel vehicles. So that's a plus. And I know a more distinguished colleague from the EEI indicated that he was an early adopter with regard to electric vehicles. And we can boast of having at least one Tesla vehicle on the island, even though it's not supported by Tesla in terms of the arrangement for support of maintenance and so on. So persons are actually adopting these strategies because they find them very, very useful and supportive of the environment. So in terms of disruptive technologies, I just want to conclude by indicating that Barbados Light and Power is investing significantly in the smart grid to facilitate the rollout of RE infrastructure. And again, with regard to the 5Ds I mentioned, we were able to deploy a GIS system within 2 years of not having any knowledge so far or previously with regard to GIS infrastructure. And we're using that to leverage things such as asset maintenance, and also ensuring that we can provide other services in terms of demand side management. And of course, we mentioned before our AMI network, which will allow us to interconnect a greater RE share onto the system. So with that being said, one of the things that I want to conclude on really is to help indicate that why we're doing all of this is that the value proposition for our customers really relates to lower fuel charges, a reduced risk of rate shock, greater bill stability, and of course, greater options for our customers, including a lower overall bill. So thank you for your time, and I hope the presentation was useful.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that, Rohan. Much appreciated. And finally, again, we saved the best for last, even on this panel. Scott Hawks is here from FortisOntario. He's going to be talking to us about a specific project, a specific initiative that his company has been working on. As soon as, there you go. PowerPoint's up, Scott.
Francis, because you did save the best till last, I felt it was incumbent on me to bring as many audiovisual aids as possible. So I've got a PowerPoint as well as a video. Good afternoon. My name's Scott Hawks. I'm President and CEO of FortisOntario. And I'm here to talk about the Watay-Nakineap Power Project. I'd like to thank the EEI for inviting me here. Thank you, Lawrence and Daniel and the rest of the team. I appreciate being here. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague Tim Lavoie in the audience, and most important, my wife Ula sitting beside him. So thanks for being here today. FortisOntario is a subsidiary of Fortis Inc., and it acts as the project manager in this project between Fortis-led investors, which own 49%, and 24 First Nations. Watay-Nakineap is Anishinaabe and it's Ojibwe for line that brings light. It's really a signature project for Fortis and has been Indigenous-led since the outset. Credit is due to the chiefs, the tribal councils, and extensive community engagement. I would refer to this as ground-up community engagement from start to finish. The engagement has exceeded EA standards and will involve continued engagement of First Nations with traditional lands impacted by the transmission corridor. Fortis was selected as the transmission partner for First Nations through a competitive process. Wataynikaneyap Power is the largest Indigenous-led transmission project in Canadian history and the largest construction project by Fortis. The project is located in northwestern Ontario, you can see in that lower map on the right side. And from north to south, it's about 480 kilometers. From east to west, it's about 410. So this area is comparable in size to the state of Nebraska or South Dakota. We opened an office in Fort William Reserve last year. Fort William is pretty much adjacent to Thunder Bay on the north shore of Lake Superior. It happens to be about 1,000 kilometers or 640 miles from our office located in Fort Erie, which is just between the border on the Niagara River. And the distance really from our office to the office in Fort William is about the same as Toronto to Nashville or from Toronto to St. John, New Brunswick. These communities are remote. From Thunder Bay to Red Lake is about a 6-hour drive, and then it's another 100 kilometers to Taxi Bay. So that's if we went up from Red Lake to Pikangikum, you can see there on the left. And when you get to Pikangikum, you could either wait and take a boat or drive on a frozen lake in the wintertime. So you can imagine the logistics for this project are pretty significant, as most of the construction will take place during winter months. There are really 3 pillars to this project. First Nations involvement in day-to-day decision-making, so it is a true partnership with Fortis. Capacity building for the First Nations in the form of employment and business opportunities during the construction and operation of the line. And the third is sufficient equity for the First Nations to have a true business, as well as the opportunity to acquire 100% ownership 25 years after commercial operation date for Phase 2. We've achieved a number of milestones over the last 5 years. And the most recent one was actually yesterday. We awarded the EPC contract to Vallard under a competitive process. We're currently working on finalizing the financial documentation in preparation for financial close also to occur this year. Once we do close, we're going to start clearing and then construction. It's going to be a 4-year construction window with Phase 1, which is a 230 kV line coming into service in 2021, and the balance of the remote connections coming into service by 2023. And before I show the video on Pikangikum, I just want to talk for a moment on the regulatory treatment. Following our designation in 2016, Wataynikaneyap applied for and was issued a deferral account to track and record development costs. In the case of Pikangikum, capacity restrictions, and that means capacity restrictions in terms of their diesel supply, meant that there was inadequate housing, and in many cases, some families would sleep in shifts in their home. Given the urgency to connect Pikangikum, the federal government stepped up, and construction began almost immediately. From a regulatory perspective, however, this we called Phase 0 was a direct contribution by the federal government to the regulated transmitter Wataynikaneyap Power. And in other words, there would be a sort of a net rate base of 0 on this project. The Pikangikum project finished on time and substantially on budget. And as a result of the federal capital contribution, there is no rate base. Phase 1 and Phase 2 required a leave to construct be filed with our Ontario regulator, the Ontario Energy Board, and included a unique approach to rates using a combination of rate designs. Phase 1 is a traditional rate-based project, as it's considered a network facility under our transmission system code, and as such, it'll be charged to all Ontario ratepayers under the uniform transmission rate as a network improvement. A unique feature of the project is basically the redirecting of funds being sent by the federal and provincial governments from the diesel future to the transmission future of the First Nations. And we entered into a federal-provincial funding agreement, and this had the effect of redirecting financial support currently directed to diesel generation in these communities to the new transmission project. The balancing or the negotiation came in respect of how much capital contribution could be made to Phase 2 while still allowing for sufficient equity to run a viable business for First Nations. This is where we used a second unique rate feature in Ontario called the Rural and Remote Rate Protection. And because the second phase is paid for, we directed part of it towards a contribution of capital, and the second as a rate subsidy under the RRP, or the Rural and Remote Rate Protection Plan. So the impact to consumers at the end of the day was minimal. The federal government's contribution of $1.55 billion is being directed in part as a capital contribution and in part to a trust, which will pay down the RRP, thereby minimizing customer rate impacts. So I'm going to show the video, and at the end of the day, the rates that we have will support the revenue requirement for First Nations-owned transmission project that will keep ratepayers whole while providing the numerous benefits associated with a grid connection. Thank you.
For decades, this community has survived and relied on diesel generators to power their homes, their school, their airport, until now. While the rest of the country was preparing to celebrate Christmas, Panelists was preparing to quietly celebrate history. In partnership with Fortis Inc., this First Nations Reserve would be the first of its kind to be serviced by Wynter Power. It's a power company operated by First Nations and for First Nations.
Does represent a new beginning for the community, for our youth communities.
Are putting a lot of faith and a lot of confidence into Wataynikaneyap Power.
I believe that if we create opportunities and create hope foundations for our young ones, that it's not just about bringing a line in. Yeah, it's to save our people.
It's a story of hope and opportunity. Christmas 2018 would be the season to look forward. A Christmas everyone in Panelists will remember for years. On December the 20th, 2018, Panelists, for the first time in its history, would be connected to the provincial power grid, thanks to an innovative and visionary partnership between Fortis Inc. and 24 remote First Nations communities across Northern Ontario.
Wataynikaneyap means a line that brings light, and Panelists is the first community that will be lit up by that line that brings light right before Christmas. So we're celebrating here, and it's a really exciting moment.
A moment that has been years in the making, but for all of its complexities and potential complications, this project was fast-tracked for Panelists and delivered in about 2 years.
The kind of challenges that this community faced, which is why the project was put on an expedited timeline, and just a challenge in itself in meeting those timelines with the various regulatory, legal, and funding requirements that we had to go through is something that we weren't sure if we were going to be able to do it. But today marks a real positive step in the right direction.
It does require everybody to work together. And when you look at being able to accomplish this project in such a short period of time, it just shows the level of cooperation. The vision of the chief here of let's make certain that we always maintain the importance of what this project is about.
I wish I could fly. I wish I could fly. I wish I could fly. All of this work is for you. It's for your future.
The sign of new hope The sign of new opportunity and a future worth looking forward to came in the form of a Christmas tree. The local residents and project workers gathered around a roaring fire in front of this tree outside the reserve's radio station to welcome their first winter with reliable, stable electricity. But the first order of business is to safely shut down the diesel generator, then connect Paganchicum to the provincial grid through the Fortis Control Centre in Fort Erie, Ontario.
Are you ready? All right, shut her down, boys. Shut her down. The generator is down.
We'll be picking up the Paganchicum community load with the new substation. Stand by.
10-4, stand by.
Jardine is plugging the tree in, everybody.
Okay, at this time I can confirm that we have load on the Paganchicum community being fed from the new substation.
It is now officially powered by the provincial grid. Our diesel generator is now shut down, and hopefully we'll never have to go back or resort to using old diesel generators.
And I just want to say congratulations to the community and hope that they enjoy the new energy that's coming to their communities.
I am so pleased for the people of Paganchicum to finally have their grid connection and to be able to turn off the diesels today. It's a great moment for them. It's a milestone for us in the Watay-Nikiniyat Power Project. And I'm so pleased with our team, the Watay-Nikiniyat Power team that made this happen.
While the Watay-Nikiniyat team turns its attentions to energizing 16 more First Nation communities, reliable energy now allows Paganchicum to address its #1 priority.
Build homes, much needed homes, and try to address or somehow alleviate the need to catch up on the backlog of homes.
Based on cooperation, respect, and true partnership, the Watay-Nikiniyat project can serve as a model for future infrastructure development in First Nation communities across the country.
By having First Nations ownership, we certainly know what our responsibilities are, and our First Nations partners also have responsibility for community engagement, for government relations, and it certainly has facilitated this project, as you can see.
It's not about just about our children today and our elders today. It's about what is it that we're setting up for the future generation.
So we have a lot of work ahead. We've got about 5 years of construction work to connect the rest of the communities to the grid so they can share in the same celebration.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Scott. Let's get into the questions. I'm conscious of time. I do have some questions that have come through on the machine. I see a hand waving over there. So Justin wants to do it the old-fashioned way. Justin, first
The
up.
old-fashioned way. So I just had a question with regards to some of the economic models used by regulators. We'll stay at a high level, but I know that Ofgem, for example, is experimenting with Todex and also PBR. But the slide this morning, I think we know the business case for transmission. It links up intermittence. It allows solar storage to use the grid. But I mean, how do we move from the business case to really operationalizing it? And I mean in a greenfield sense. So. Do you want to maybe take a kick at that?
Who wants to? I know you wanted to ask that question earlier today as well, so who wants to go first? Rudy?
I'll give it a shot. I'm going to assume I know what you mean by operationalizing it, so I'm going to run with it. So you're right. So, we have experience with Ofgem in the UK with Rio. We're doing a reset starting in 2021, so we'll have Rio going forward, but in a reset format from 2021 to 2026. And Ofgem looks at TOTEX, the total expenditures that you've got there. And there is heavily dose of performance-based rate making there. I think that works well in the UK. It may work well in other countries in Europe. The big challenge, and I don't think why that would work for the transmission network in the United States, is the complexity. In the U.S., you have about 400 owners operating about 300,000 miles of transmission across the U.S. So the complexity of doing that across the whole transmission grid is going to be very, very complex, huge change. And if there's an appetite for that level of change, there are probably other things that would get attacked before that. But having said that, I do see it being really effective on a specific project basis in the U.S., at least on transmission. On distribution, we are already looking at some things around performance-based rates at various levels in our jurisdictions. But on transmission, I think it would be very difficult to execute that in the U.S.
Yeah, I would agree with Rudy. However, I would think that there would be an opportunity if you have a vertically integrated utility in a limited geographic region. Then there might be some opportunities to look at that kind of rate making.
One thing I just wanted to add, and that was, I think if we think about I think getting to your point around operationalizing it, meaning moving the transition along, I think we have to almost expand our view of the business model to just around not just being rate making, but thinking about incentivizing solutions as opposed to just incentivizing what you do today. And by that I mean, when I look at our transmission network in the U.S., we very much look at it as a policy enabler. And I want to be incented on that network being a policy enabler. And in this case, it's helping decarbonize the Northeast. So that should mean I should get incented for building transmission, or for, instead of building transmission, building a battery instead. Or for deploying technologies like smart wires and some other technologies on the grid that lets me optimize the grid more effectively. So we're trying to look at broadening that definition around what we get incented for, and we think we get incented for delivering solutions.
Yeah, I was just going to comment as it relates to transmission on the Wate project. We really had to break this down in terms of what was going to be a network facility and then what was going to need, support in terms of the RRP. In terms of PBR, I can comment our experience in terms of the distribution side in Ontario. And, on the one hand, we've had PBR in our, 5-year rebasing cycle, and it has, I think, driven a lot of the local distribution companies to look at cost. But I think the challenge comes for us from the shareholders' perspective is that when you are investing a lot of capital in the system, and this is simply sustaining capital, and you have pretty flat or minimal growth in a growing rate base, it's very difficult to achieve your allowed ROE. So I think it has its challenges.
Okay, so a couple of quick ones here, just some quick one-offs. Let's start off with David. How does BC handle battery storage, which is both a producer and a load in rates?
Well, it's a good question, and we haven't. There isn't a significant amount of battery storage, so it's not something that we have a lot of experience with. We also don't have we don't have any time of use rate structure here, but it is something that I could understand that that if there is a significant uptake, then it's something we would have to take a look at. We'd have to take a look at building a rate structure that would incentivize an amount of battery storage that would be an optimal amount, so that customers could make an investment and realize a saving in their bills that would also provide utilities with the opportunity to optimize their system at the same time.
Okay. Sure,
if I may comment on an innovative approach we use to battery storage, our first battery storage deployment, what we did as a utility was assume the majority of the risk from that deployment, and we passed the recovery of that battery through the fuel clause adjustment mechanism. And in that way, by the benefits of the fuel arbitrage that was achieved by the battery, we were able to share, if we achieve 105%, of the benefits from the battery. We will pass some of that benefits on to the customer, and we will retain about 95%. So it's a very innovative methodology we use for the recovery of the battery asset, but future battery assets we intend to recover through the traditional rate-based methodology. But the initial one was passed through the fuel clause adjustment mechanism.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Another quick one, this one for you, Scott. Why did you choose to extend transmission lines rather than establishing a microgrid with the First Nations?
Reliability.
And then reliability
and reliability. Yeah.
Do you want to maybe just...
Well, I think once the transmission line is connected, it will open up other opportunities for renewables in the north. But really, from our perspective, it was the most reliable way of getting power to these communities.
All right. So this would be for whoever on the panel wants to take a crack at this. In a world where peer-to-peer solar energy trade can take place between neighbors, such as Brooklyn Blockchain, what is the future of so-called rate design if we move into a peer-to-peer world? Who wants to take a crack at that? That's a pretty difficult question.
I guess I'll have to, since I live in Brooklyn and I'm about so I think there's a long way between peer-to-peer energy transactions, primarily because there isn't enough volume yet of people who can trade between those two, right? But having said that, everything happens a lot faster than we ever anticipate or think about. So I'm always wary to say something goes away because something new comes up, because people keep telling me I'll invest less in transmission because solar is being built, and I'm investing more in transmission because the solar is being built. So I don't think things go away. I do think they will change and take on different forms and different shapes. So while I do think we will see that peer-to-peer transfer of energy take place in, I think, limited pockets, they still depend on a distribution network to make that happen. So I don't see regulation or rate making going away. I do think it just changes.
Okay. And another question has come in through here, still on a similar topic. When individuals buy solar panels for their home, they're penalized with a solar income tax on the power produced, deterring clean energy use. Will that change?
Income tax policy change? Is that the question?
I guess, yeah. Because it's not incentive.
Yeah, I guess that would be something for government to deal with, whether income tax policy changes or not. I don't have any further comment, really.
Just if I may comment, just as a comment, in Barbados, what we see with regard to incentivizing the use of solar panels at the distributed level, actually the government policy initially incentivized by giving an additional return for persons who invested in solar panels both at the residential and the commercial level, and in that way that actually drove the adoption of distributed solar. So it was the initial example was actually incentivizing, but those with the change in government, a lot of those incentives have slowly been eroded. But what we find is that if you want to encourage adoption, it's best to incentivize as opposed to having a penalty.
Okay, last two questions. Oh, it looks like we have three questions. We'll start in the back, and then Graham, and then Lawrence, and that's it. All right.
Hi, Marianne Hatch with FTI Consulting. Looking at what's happened in the States, we've seen things like value of solar discussions where those resources may be, they might receive money for certain attributes they possess. We're seeing a conversation in the wholesale electricity market about compensating generators for attributes they might bring to the market. If we were to say, apply that to transmission, and try to be compensated for value that transmission brings to customers and to the market, what attributes might you want to see added into that value stack?
I would say One would be price stability to a region. You know, before we made some major investments in transmission in New England, we had a lot of congestion costs. That has come down. So one would be price stability. Another, I think, would also have to be some, as I mentioned before, I see transmission as a policy enabler. It has to be something around driving the decarbonization agenda, right? By integrating and doing upgrades on transmission, we're going to be able to integrate and move power around the Northeast from 15 gigawatts of offshore wind. So I would say one has to be price and price stability. The second has to be some environmental attribute as well.
Okay, I did promise Graham and Lawrence the last two questions. So
yeah, I mean, maybe Francis, just a little bit of an observation and a little bit of a question as well. Perhaps getting back to the question that was raised by our colleague first off. You know, Rudy, I think, was being very polite about his summary of the UK regulatory scene. So maybe just a couple of observations on that. So the TODEX or the Rio regime, certainly from a transmission point of view, has not even run one full cycle yet. And the regulators already decided that the next term will be 5 years, not 8 years, even though that was a big pathway, you know, sort of big message when they launched the model. The second observation would be in the midterm reviews that they've done on transmission, they've made two big disallowance decisions, arguably against things that it was impossible to have total foresight of. So be a little bit careful when you take the UK as a shining example in some of this stuff. I'm not saying it's totally bad, but it's not totally good either. And basically, it still boils down to two things. What's your rate of return? What's the value of your regulatory asset base? The rest is noise. And depending whether you get those right or wrong, depending on your point of view, that's still the big ticket item.
okay, Lawrence, you get the last word here.
Thank you. So, sorry, Mr. Moderator, but I have two questions, but they're not for anyone on the panel. I just want to expand the conversation a little bit by asking two individuals to comment on what they've heard so far. And I don't want to put them in the spot, but I have to do it since I have the microphone. So basically, we haven't heard from the investment community yet. And so I just like to ask two individuals, one, John Thorndike, with regards to business models, what you've heard, your perspective from an investment perspective, what do you think of what you've heard so far regarding the business models? And also from an economist standpoint, someone who's worked on a lot of islands around the world, especially in Micronesia, I want to hear from Robert Young. So their perspective, I think, would help to sort of frame up the conversation. So maybe John and then Robert. Get the mic.
That okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Generally speaking, investors expect the stock market to discount all risks, but in fact, some risks are so long tail and so hard to quantify that the market doesn't really focus on them in the short term. And I think generally in the utility industry, a lot of risks, which are very real risks, just aren't quantifiable right now in the marketplace. So that would be my answer to that.
I guess my perspective is that the transition from a fossil or carbon-based electricity grid to a renewable-based grid changes the economics. You've gone from a grid where 30, 50, 70% of the cost of generation are variable to a grid where more and more of the costs are fixed and don't vary with the level of consumption. And from a regulatory standpoint, I think the regulators have not come up or faced that change, and it takes time in regulation, but I think they need to look at that because you've got some very distorted price signals right now, especially in West Coast states like Oregon, Washington, here in BC, where you're pretty much almost all hydro, and yet you're recovering a large percentage of your revenue based on energy consumption.
All right, with that, I see that we have actually gone over time, Justin. by 3 minutes. I want to thank the panel for taking the time to present and to join us today. It was definitely enlightening, and I'll hand it back over to our Master of Ceremonies, Justin.
Great, thanks, Francis. So before we leave, I just wanted to say a special thank you to Daniel Knoll from EI, who's been hiding in the back but running around all day so that we can be up here talking. Round of applause for him. Quick reminder that we'll be back here 9 a.m. for the panels tomorrow, but registration breakfast is at 8. We'll be holding a networking reception, kind of post a celebration there in the atrium right behind us. So please stay, come grab a drink. Word to the wise from a Canadian: if you're offered, we have many great wines and beers, but if you're offered a beer called Canadian, don't fall for the trap. I'm from Toronto, so I can drink it, but that's not everyone. So have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.